Ellen Craft born and enslaved, born into a lead. The most dangerous escape from slavery in American history did not begin with running through forests at night or hiding in swamps. It began with a decision to walk openly through the heart of slave society, in daylight, surrounded by the very people who enforced the system. It required an enslaved woman to erase her identity completely, to deny her race, her gender, her voice, and even her right to exist as herself. One mistake would mean capture. One moment of hesitation would mean chains. And yet, the plan worked, not because slavery was weak, but because it was blind to its own contradictions. This is the story of Ellen Craft, an enslaved woman who escaped bondage by pretending to be a white man. Her story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about race, gender, power, and freedom in 19th century America. It is not only a story of courage, but of intelligence, strategy, and a deep understanding of how American society functioned. To understand how such an escape is possible, we must first understand the world that created Ellen Craft and the lies that world depended on to survive. Ellen Craft was born in 1826 in Clinton, Georgia, into a system that defined people not by character or humanity, but by ownership. She was enslaved from birth, yet her appearance disrupted the rigid racial logic of slavery. Ellen was the daughter of an enslaved black woman named Maria and a white man who was also her enslaver. This fact alone reveals one of the most disturbing realities of American slavery. Sexual exploitation was embedded in the system itself. Enslaved women had no legal right to refuse sexual access, and the children born from such abuse automatically inherited enslaved status, regardless of the father's identity. Because Ellen was 3/4 white by ancestry, she had very light skin and facial features that closely resembled those of white Americans. In another society, this might have afforded her privilege. In the slave-holding South, it created danger. Southern racial ideology insisted on clear boundaries between white and black, free and enslaved. Ellen's existence challenged those boundaries. She looked like those who held power, yet legally, she was property. This contradiction followed her throughout her childhood and shaped the conditions that would later make her escape possible. Ellen grew up in her enslaver's household, where she performed domestic labor rather than field work. This spared her some of the physical brutality inflicted on plantation laborers, but it did not spare her from control, humiliation, or fear. Domestic slavery required constant obedience and emotional restraint. Enslaved servants were expected to anticipate the needs of their enslavers, suppress their own feelings, and exist as extensions of white households rather than as individuals. Ellen learned early that survival depended on silence and careful behavior. As Ellen grew older, her resemblance to the white members of the family became increasingly uncomfortable for her enslavers. She was a visible reminder of sexual violence, hypocrisy, and the instability of racial categories. Rather than confront these realities, the family chose a solution that was common in slave society. They removed the reminder. Ellen was given away as a wedding gift to her enslaver's daughter. This act was entirely legal and socially accepted. Enslaved people were frequently transferred as gifts, inheritances, or financial assets. For Ellen, it meant permanent separation from her mother. This forced separation was one of the most traumatic moments of Ellen's life. She was torn away without consent, explanation, or the possibility of return. Slavery specialized in this kind of violence, not only physical, but emotional. Families were broken routinely, reinforcing the understanding that enslaved people had no claim to stability or belonging. Ellen would later recall this moment as foundational to her desire for freedom. The pain of separation taught her that slavery would eventually take everything unless she escaped. After being transferred, Ellen was sent to Macon, Georgia, where she became the personal servant of her new enslaver. Her daily life involved sewing, cleaning, and attending closely to the household's needs. She was under constant observation and had little privacy. Although she lived indoors and wore better clothing than field laborers, her lack of autonomy was absolute. She could not travel freely, choose her work, or make decisions about her own future. It was in Macon that Ellen met William Craft, an enslaved man who worked as a skilled cabinet maker. William's trade afforded him slightly more mobility and access to information than many enslaved laborers, but he was still legally property. Ellen and William formed a relationship grounded in mutual respect and shared suffering. They married with the permission of their enslavers, but this marriage had no legal standing. Under slavery, marriage between enslaved people offered no protection. Husbands and wives could be sold apart at any moment. This reality weighed heavily on Ellen. The prospect of bearing children into slavery filled her with dread. She understood that motherhood under enslavement meant watching children be claimed as property, sold, or abused. This fear became a powerful motivator. Ellen later stated that her determination to escape hardened when she realized that remaining enslaved meant condemning future generations to the same fate. Over time, Ellen's appearance continued to create tension. When accompanying her enslaver's family in public, she was often mistaken for a white woman. At the same time, she could be punished severely for the slightest act of independence. This contradiction forced Ellen to become acutely aware of how race and gender operated in American society. She observed that white men moved through the world with confidence and authority, rarely questioned. Enslaved black women, by contrast, were scrutinized, controlled, and dismissed. These observations planted the seeds of a radical idea. Ellen and William understood that escape attempts typically failed because enslaved people were immediately suspected, questioned, and pursued. Traditional routes, running away on foot, hiding in forests, relying on secrecy, were dangerous and often unsuccessful. They began to consider an alternative approach, not hiding from the system, but exploiting its assumptions. The idea that emerged was astonishing in its simplicity and risk. Ellen would disguise herself as a white man. William would pose as her enslaved servant. Together, they would travel openly using trains, steamboats, and hotels, moving through slave states without attempting to hide. The plan relied on the fact that American society trusted white male authority almost without question. A white man traveling with an enslaved servant was not suspicious. It was normal. The obstacles were immense. Ellen could not read or write, a serious problem when travel required signing documents and registering at hotels. She was also young, soft-spoken, and female. To overcome these challenges, Ellen adopted a series of calculated strategies. She cut her hair short and wore men's clothing. She bound her chest and practiced masculine posture and movement. She wrapped one arm in bandages and pretended to be ill, allowing her to avoid writing and to speak as little as possible. This plan required extraordinary discipline. Ellen would have to suppress every instinct for weeks, denying her identity completely. She would have to trust that society's commitment to racial hierarchy would protect her from scrutiny. William, meanwhile, would have to play the role of a submissive enslaved man, even while relying on Ellen's authority to secure their passage. By late 1848, Ellen and William had prepared as much as they could. They saved what little money they managed to obtain, studied travel routes, and rehearsed their roles. They understood that once they began, there would be no second chances. Discovery meant capture. Capture meant separation, punishment, or sail farther south. On December 21, 1848, Ellen Craft dressed as a white man and stepped into public view. With William at her side, she began one of the most daring journeys in American history. Their escape would test every assumption upon which slavery depended. Walking through the heart of slavery, on the morning of December 21, 1848, Ellen Craft stepped into a role that demanded absolute control over every movement, expression, and sound she made. Dressed as a young white gentleman, she left behind not only her identity as an enslaved woman, but also her gender, her voice, and her past. At her side walked William Craft, playing the role of her enslaved servant. Their escape did not rely on secrecy or darkness. Instead, it depended on the assumption that white male authority was unquestionable, and that slavery was so normalized that it rarely invited scrutiny. Their journey began in Macon, Georgia, a city firmly embedded in the slaveholding economy. From the moment they entered the public sphere, the danger was immediate. Ellen was required to behave in ways that society expected of white men: confident but reserved, authoritative but not emotional. Any hesitation or deviation could draw attention. William, meanwhile, had to perform submission convincingly, despite knowing that their survival depended on Ellen's authority over him. The first major test came at the train station. Purchasing tickets required interaction with white officials who expected certain behaviors from white travelers. Ellen avoided conversation as much as possible, relying on her feigned illness to justify silence. The bandaged arm served a critical purpose, preventing her from being asked to sign documents, which would have exposed her illiteracy. This detail was not incidental. It demonstrated careful planning based on an understanding of how bureaucracy functioned within enslaved society. As they boarded the train, Ellen and William were surrounded by slaveholders, merchants, and travelers who embodied the system they were trying to escape. The irony was profound. Slaveholders casually discussed business and politics, unaware that the person sitting among them was legally property, pretending to be their social equal. William stood quietly nearby, playing the role expected of him, reinforcing the illusion that made their escape possible. Each interaction carried risk. At one point, a fellow passenger engaged Ellen in conversation, asking routine questions that could easily unravel her disguise. Ellen responded minimally, relying on gestures and brief statements to avoid revealing her voice, which could betray her gender. The man accepted her behavior without suspicion, interpreting her silence as the reserved demeanor of an ill gentleman rather than a sign of deception. This moment illustrated a key truth about slave society. Assumptions about race and gender often replaced critical observation. As the train traveled northward, Ellen and William encountered officials responsible for checking tickets and verifying identities. In one particularly dangerous encounter, a conductor asked Ellen to sign her name. Ellen gestured to her injured arm and indicated that she was unable to write. The explanation was accepted without question. The same society that denied enslaved people basic rights extended extraordinary trust to white men, even when evidence was lacking. After disembarking from the train, Ellen and William continued their journey by steamboat, another environment where enslaved labor and white authority intersected visibly. Steamboats often carried enslaved people being transported for sale, along with free white passengers who accepted this reality as ordinary. Ellen's position as a white male traveler shielded her from scrutiny, while William's presence as an enslaved servant appeared entirely normal. On board the steamboat, Ellen faced one of the most dangerous moments of the journey. She encountered a man who knew her enslaver personally. Recognition could have been fatal. The man engaged her in conversation, clearly attempting to place her identity. Ellen responded cautiously, keeping her answers vague and brief. She relied heavily on her illness to excuse her discomfort and lack of sociability. The encounter passed without exposure, but it underscored the constant tension of the escape. Familiarity was as dangerous as suspicion. Throughout the journey, Ellen was forced to confront the psychological toll of her disguise. She had to suppress instinctive behaviors associated with femininity, avoid eye contact that might be interpreted as submissive, and maintain a posture that conveyed authority. Even small actions such as how she sat or walked required conscious control. This level of self-regulation over extended periods was exhausting, yet essential. William's role was equally demanding. He had to defer publicly to Ellen, accept verbal instructions, and perform obedience convincingly. Any sign of familiarity or equality could raise suspicion. At the same time, William bore the emotional weight of watching his wife be treated with deference as a white man while he played the role of property. This inversion of their private relationship was painful but necessary. As they moved closer to the north, the risks did not diminish. Free states were not safe havens. Fugitive slave laws required officials and citizens to assist in the capture of escaped slaves. Slave catchers operated openly, and suspicion of black travelers was common. Ellen and William's strategy was effective precisely because it avoided the typical markers of fugitives. They did not hide, they performed normalcy. One of the most dangerous aspects of the journey involved staying in hotels, where registration and interaction with staff were unavoidable. Ellen's inability to write posed a significant risk. Once again, her bandaged arm and assumed illness served as protection. Hotel staff accepted her explanations, and William handled arrangements that were appropriate for an enslaved servant. These interactions highlighted how deeply racial assumptions shape behavior. The presence of a submissive black servant validated Ellen's identity in the eyes of white observers. As the days passed, fatigue set in. Ellen's illness was feigned, but the strain of constant vigilance was real. She could not relax, even briefly. A single slip could undo everything. William, too, had to maintain composure, suppressing fear and emotion. Their success depended on mutual trust and absolute discipline. The final leg of the journey brought them into territory where slavery was less entrenched but still legally enforced. The transition did not bring immediate relief. Instead, it introduced new uncertainties. White officials in the North were sometimes more inquisitive, especially regarding travelers accompanied by enslaved people. Ellen continued to rely on minimal speech and authoritative gestures to navigate these encounters. At last, after several days of travel, Ellen and William reached Philadelphia, a city with a strong abolitionist presence. Crossing into Pennsylvania did not automatically guarantee safety, but it marked a significant milestone. They were now among people who openly opposed slavery and were willing to offer assistance. When Ellen and William finally revealed their true identities to abolitionists, the reaction was one of astonishment and admiration. Their escape was immediately recognized as extraordinary. Unlike many fugitives who arrived traumatized and destitute, Ellen and William had arrived by exploiting the very structures that upheld slavery. Their story spread quickly among abolitionist circles, not as a romantic tale but as evidence of the system's contradictions. Ellen's successful performance as a white man exposed the arbitrary nature of racial categories and the fragility of a system that relied on appearance and assumption rather than truth. Yet freedom did not bring immediate peace. Ellen and William were acutely aware that their safety was temporary. Fugitive slave laws meant that they could still be captured and returned to bondage. Public knowledge of their escape increased both their influence and their risk. Slave catchers were motivated by financial reward and legal authority. The crafts understood that survival would require continued vigilance and, eventually, further movement. Their arrival in the North marked the end of one phase of struggle and the beginning of another. They had escaped physical bondage, but the nation they entered was still deeply divided over slavery. Ellen Craft's daring escape would soon make her a symbol of resistance, but it would also make her a target. The journey that began with disguise and deception was far from over. Fame, fear, and the law that comes had them in hand. When Ellen and William Craft arrived safely in the North, their escape was immediately recognized as extraordinary. Among abolitionists, stories of fugitives from slavery were common, but the method Ellen and William had used set their journey apart. They had not relied on secrecy or concealment. Instead, they had traveled openly through slaveholding territory by exploiting the assumptions that underpinned American society. Their success forced abolitionists to confront a powerful truth. Slavery depended not only on violence and law, but on social habits, racial stereotypes, and blind trust in whiteness and male authority. In Philadelphia and later in Boston, Ellen and William were welcomed into abolitionist networks that provided them with housing, employment, and protection. These communities understood that fugitives were constantly at risk and that survival required collective effort. The Crafts quickly became known figures within these circles, and their story spread rapidly through newspapers, pamphlets, and word of mouth. Abolitionists saw in Ellen's escape a vivid demonstration of slavery's moral and logical contradictions, and they encouraged the Crafts to share their experiences publicly. Public attention brought opportunity but also danger. Speaking openly about their escape increased awareness of the brutality of slavery, but it also made Ellen and William visible targets. Slave catchers closely followed abolitionist publications, searching for clues that could lead them to escaped enslaved people. Every public appearance increased the risk of capture. The Crafts lived under constant threat, knowing that legal freedom had not yet been secured. Despite these risks, Ellen and William began speaking at abolitionist meetings, where audiences listened with fascination and disbelief. Ellen's presence challenged deeply ingrained beliefs about race and gender. Many white Northerners struggled to reconcile the fact that a woman they might have treated with deference as a white man in the South had been legally enslaved. Her story forced listeners to confront how arbitrary racial categories truly were and how easily the system could be manipulated. At the same time, Ellen's experience highlighted the unique vulnerability of enslaved women. Her escape required her to deny not only her race but also her gender, revealing how little power enslaved women held within the social hierarchy. Abolitionists increasingly framed her story as evidence that slavery deformed every human relationship it touched, reducing people to roles defined by ownership rather than humanity. The growing visibility of the crafts coincided with rising political tension over slavery. In 1850, the United States Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act as part of a broader compromise intended to preserve the Union. This law dramatically increased the power of slaveholders and slave catchers by requiring citizens and officials in free states to assist in the capture of escaped enslaved people. Accused fugitives were denied the right to testify in their own defense, and those who aided them faced severe penalties. For Ellen and William, the Fugitive Slave Act transformed their situation overnight. What had already been a precarious existence became openly dangerous. Slave catchers now had explicit legal authority to operate in northern cities, and Boston, despite its strong abolitionist presence, became a hunting ground. The craft's fame made them especially vulnerable. Slaveholders from Georgia soon began organizing efforts to reclaim them, motivated both by financial incentive and by the symbolic importance of punishing such a public escape. Rumors of impending capture spread quickly through abolitionist networks. Armed slave catchers were reported to be searching for the crafts, and local officials sympathetic to the law were prepared to cooperate. Abolitionists responded by mobilizing community defense. Meetings were held, plans were discussed, and contingency strategies were developed. Some abolitionists advocated armed resistance if necessary, believing that compliance with the law was morally unacceptable. Ellen and William were forced into hiding. They moved between safe houses, avoided public appearances, and relied on trusted allies for protection. The psychological strain was intense. Freedom had been achieved only to be threatened again by a legal system designed to uphold slavery's reach across state lines. Ellen later recalled the constant fear of betrayal, knowing that a single informant could undo everything. The crafts situation became a national issue within abolitionist circles. Newspapers debated the morality of the Fugitive Slave Act and the responsibility of Northern citizens to resist unjust laws. Ellen's story was frequently cited as evidence that the law protected cruelty rather than justice. Her escape, once celebrated as a triumph, now underscored the lengths to which the federal government would go to sustain slavery. As threats intensified, abolitionist leaders began urging the crafts to leave the United States altogether. Britain, where slavery had been abolished and where public opinion strongly favored abolition, offered relative safety. Although leaving meant abandoning the country Ellen and William hoped to see transformed, remaining posed an unacceptable risk. The decision to leave was painful but pragmatic. Survival took precedence over visibility. In 1850, Ellen and William departed for England, effectively entering exile. Their departure was both a personal loss and a political statement. It highlighted the failure of the United States to protect those who had escaped slavery and underscored the international dimensions of the abolitionist struggle. In leaving, the crafts joined a growing number of formerly enslaved Americans who sought safety and dignity abroad. In England, Ellen and William found a society eager to hear their story. British abolitionists welcomed them, provided opportunities to speak, and offered educational support. Ellen, who had been denied formal education under slavery, began learning to read and write for the first time. This process represented a profound reversal of her earlier experiences, allowing her to claim intellectual agency that slavery had sought to deny. As Ellen reflected on her journey, she recognized that her escape had exposed truths about American society that extended beyond slavery itself. It revealed how power operated through appearance and assumption, how laws could be weaponized to sustain injustice, and how resistance required both courage and strategy. Her story was no longer just about personal freedom. It had become a critique of a nation's values. The crafts' exile marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. While they were now beyond the immediate reach of American slave catchers, their connection to the struggle against slavery remained strong. Ellen's role would continue to evolve, shifting from fugitive to educator, from symbol of escape to advocate for lasting change. Exile, education, and life reclaimed Ellen and William Craft's arrival in England marked a turning point not only in their personal lives, but also in the international struggle against slavery. Unlike the United States, Britain had abolished slavery throughout its empire in 1833, and public sentiment strongly favored abolition. The Crafts entered a society where they were no longer legally threatened by slave catchers or hostile federal laws. For the first time since Ellen's birth, her body was no longer claimed by anyone else. Yet freedom, even when legally secured, did not erase the psychological scars of enslavement or the long years spent living in fear. British abolitionists welcomed the Crafts warmly. They were invited into reform circles, introduced to intellectual communities, and encouraged to speak publicly about their experiences. Ellen's escape story captivated audiences, not because it was sensational, but because it exposed fundamental truths about American slavery. Her successful disguise as a white man forced listeners to confront how artificial racial categories truly were. If race could be performed so convincingly, then the moral logic of slavery collapsed under its own contradictions. One of the most significant transformations of Ellen's life occurred during her years in England. She received an education. In the United States, laws and customs had denied enslaved people access to literacy, viewing education as a threat to the system. In England, Ellen was able to learn to read and write openly, without fear of punishment. This process was both empowering and painful. Literacy allowed Ellen to articulate her own experiences more fully, but it also forced her to revisit memories of separation, fear, and survival that slavery had imposed. Ellen and William used their time in England not only to heal, but also to work. They became active participants in the abolitionist movement, delivering lectures that connected American slavery to broader questions of human rights and moral responsibility. Their testimony helped sustain international pressure on the United States, reminding British audiences that abolition was incomplete as long as slavery persisted elsewhere. Ellen's presence on stage, an educated, articulate woman who had once been legally property, stood as a powerful refutation of racist ideology. In 1860, Ellen and William published Running 1,000 Miles for Freedom, a detailed account of their escape and subsequent experiences. The book served multiple purposes. It documented the mechanics of their journey, preserving it for history. It exposed the cruelty and absurdity of slavery to a global audience, and it asserted Ellen's intellectual authority over her own narrative, countering a long tradition in which enslaved people's stories were filtered through others. Writing the book was itself an act of resistance, reclaiming control over a story that slavery had tried to erase. The outbreak of the American Civil War in 1861 transformed the political landscape once again. From England, the Crafts followed developments closely. The war confirmed what abolitionists had long argued. Slavery was incompatible with democratic ideals and national stability. When the war ended in 1865 and slavery was formally abolished in the United States, Ellen and William faced a difficult decision. Returning home meant confronting a nation still deeply shaped by racism and violence, but it also offered an opportunity to participate directly in rebuilding a post-slavery society. The Crafts returned to the United States during the Reconstruction era, a period marked by both hope and profound resistance. Formerly enslaved people sought education, land, and political participation, while white supremacist forces worked aggressively to restore racial hierarchy. Ellen and William settled in Georgia, where they established a school for newly freed African Americans. Education, which had once been denied to Ellen, became central to her vision of freedom. She believed that literacy and learning were essential tools for resisting exploitation and asserting citizenship. Operating a school in the post-war South was dangerous. Violence against black educators and institutions was widespread, and the Crafts faced threats from groups opposed to racial equality. Despite these dangers, Ellen remained committed to the work. Her life had demonstrated that knowledge was transformative, and she sought to extend that opportunity to others. Teaching was not merely an occupation for Ellen. It was a continuation of her resistance to the system that had once defined her as property. As Reconstruction collapsed and Jim Crow laws began to solidify racial segregation, Ellen witnessed many of the promises of emancipation being undermined. Voting rights were restricted, economic opportunities were limited, and violence was used to enforce racial order. These developments were deeply discouraging, but they did not erase the significance of what Ellen had achieved. Her escape and subsequent activism remained powerful examples of how individuals could exploit the weaknesses of oppressive systems. In her later years, Ellen lived a quieter life, but her legacy continued to grow. Abolitionists, historians, and later civil rights activists, recognized her story as more than an extraordinary escape. It was a lesson in how power operates through assumptions and how resistance often requires creativity as much as courage. Ellen Craft's life demonstrated that freedom was not simply granted. It was taken, negotiated, and defended. Ellen Craft died in 1891, having lived long enough to see slavery abolished, but also long enough to see new forms of racial oppression emerge. Her life spanned one of the most turbulent periods in American history, and her experiences captured its contradictions. She was born enslaved into a system that claimed absolute authority over her body and identity. She escaped by exposing that system's dependence on illusion and hierarchy, and she spent her later years working to ensure that freedom meant more than the absence of chains. Today, Ellen Craft's story remains deeply relevant. It challenges simplistic narratives of slavery and freedom, reminding us that oppression is maintained not only through violence, but through everyday assumptions about race, gender, and authority. Her escape reveals how those assumptions can be turned against the systems that rely on them. More importantly, her life demonstrates that resistance is often quiet, strategic, and deeply human. Ellen Craft did not simply run away from slavery. She walked through it, understood it, and used its own rules to dismantle its hold over her life. In doing so, she left behind a legacy that continues to challenge how history is told and how freedom is understood, reconstruction, resistance, and the limits of freedom. When Ellen Craft returned to the United States after years in England, she entered a nation that had formally abolished slavery but had not resolved its deepest racial contradictions. The Civil War had ended, and the 13th Amendment had eliminated legal slavery. Yet freedom remained fragile, uneven, and fiercely contested. For Ellen, the return was not a triumphant homecoming, but a confrontation with the reality that the structures of oppression she had escaped were being rebuilt in new forms. The Reconstruction era promised transformation. Formerly enslaved people sought education, land, political power, and legal protection. For a brief period, these goals appeared achievable. Federal troops occupied the South. New constitutional amendments expanded citizenship and voting rights, and Black communities organized schools, churches, and civic institutions. Ellen Craft viewed education as the cornerstone of this new society. Having been denied literacy during slavery, she understood that control over knowledge had been one of the system's most effective weapons. Education, in her view, was not merely a skill, but a form of defense against exploitation. Together with William Craft, Ellen established schools in Georgia to educate formerly enslaved children and adults. These schools operated under constant threat. White supremacist groups viewed Black education as a direct challenge to racial hierarchy. Teachers were harassed, buildings were burned, and violence was used deliberately to discourage learning. Ellen faced these dangers with the same strategic resolve that had defined her escape. She believed that retreat would validate the logic of oppression. Continuing to teach was, therefore, an act of resistance. Despite these efforts, the promise of Reconstruction began to collapse in the 1870s. Federal commitment waned, troops were withdrawn, and Southern states regained control over local governance. New laws and practices emerged that effectively reversed many of the gains made by formerly enslaved people. Voting rights were restricted through intimidation and legal barriers. Economic systems such as sharecropping trapped Black families in cycles of debt and dependency. Violence became a tool of political enforcement. For Ellen Craft, this period revealed the limits of legal emancipation. Slavery had ended, but the ideology that justified it remained powerful. White supremacy adapted rather than disappeared. Ellen had escaped a system that relied on ownership of bodies, but she now witnessed a system that controlled lives through law, economics, and terror. This continuity underscored a painful truth. Freedom required constant defense, not only against overt bondage, but against subtler forms of domination. As public attention shifted away from Reconstruction, Ellen's role became less visible in national narratives. Unlike male abolitionist leaders who continued to publish and lecture extensively, Ellen's contributions were often minimized or overshadowed. This marginalization reflected broader patterns in historical memory. Women's leadership, particularly Black women's leadership, was frequently under-recognized, even when it played a central role in transformative events. Yet Ellen's influence persisted in quieter ways. Her life story circulated within black communities and among reformers as evidence that courage and intelligence could expose the weaknesses of oppressive systems. Her escape was studied not as a romantic tale, but as a lesson in strategy. It demonstrated that power often rests on assumptions that can be challenged, and that resistance does not always require confrontation. It can also involve manipulation of the rules themselves. Ellen's later years were shaped by reflection and adaptation. She had lived through slavery, escape, exile, war, and Reconstruction. Each phase revealed different aspects of American society, from its capacity for cruelty to its potential for reform. Ellen understood that progress was neither linear nor guaranteed. Gains could be reversed, and victories could be hollow if not protected. In this context, Ellen Craft's life complicates simplistic narratives of freedom. Her escape was extraordinary, but it did not mark the end of struggle. Instead, it highlighted how freedom is a process rather than a destination. Ellen did not merely seek personal liberation. She sought a society in which freedom could be sustained across generations. This broader vision distinguished her from narratives that focused solely on individual success. By the end of her life, Ellen had become a witness to history's contradictions. She had seen slavery justified as natural, watched it collapse under its own moral weight, and then observed its logic reassert itself through new mechanisms. Her experiences offered a long view of oppression and resistance, reminding future generations that systems of inequality are resilient but not invincible. Ellen Craft's legacy, therefore, lies not only in the daring nature of her escape, but in the lessons her life offers about power, identity, and survival. She demonstrated that oppression depends on compliance with its categories, and that disrupting those categories can create openings for change. Her life urges us to question the assumptions we inherit, and to recognize how easily injustice can be normalized. Gender, witness, and the architecture of power. To fully understand the significance of Ellen Craft's escape, it is necessary to examine the deeper social structures that made it possible. Her journey was not merely an act of bravery. It was a precise exposure of how power operated in 19th century America. Slavery was sustained not only by chains and violence, but by rigid assumptions about race, gender, class, and authority. Ellen succeeded because she understood these assumptions intuitively and used them against the system that enforced her bondage. At the core of Ellen's escape was whiteness as a social credential. In the antebellum United States, whiteness functioned as a form of unspoken identification. White individuals, especially white men, moved through public spaces with a presumption of legitimacy. Their presence did not need explanation. Their authority was rarely questioned. This cultural reflex was so deeply embedded that it replaced formal verification in many situations. Ellen's disguise exploited this reality. She did not need documents to prove her freedom. Her appearance did that work for her. Gender compounded this effect. White masculinity was associated with independence, rationality, and control. A white man traveling with an enslaved servant was considered ordinary and unremarkable. Ellen's performance as a white male invalid provided a perfect shield. Illness explained silence. Masculinity explained authority. Whiteness explained legitimacy. Together, these elements formed a social armor that no disguise alone could have provided. At the same time, Ellen's escape revealed the extreme vulnerability of enslaved black women. Had she attempted to flee openly as herself, suspicion would have been immediate. Black women were assumed to be enslaved unless proven otherwise, and even free black women were routinely harassed, detained, or kidnapped. Ellen's success was therefore not evidence of privilege, but proof of how narrowly freedom was defined and how selectively it was granted. Ellen's transformation required not only physical disguise but psychological discipline. She had to suppress behaviors learned through a lifetime of enforced submission. She could not lower her gaze, speak softly, or display hesitation. Every gesture had to reinforce authority. This performance underscores how deeply gender roles were internalized and enforced. Ellen was not simply pretending to be a man. She was navigating a society that demanded specific behaviors from bodies it categorized as male or female. William Craft's role in the escape further illustrates these dynamics. His performance as an enslaved servant validated Ellen's identity in the eyes of white observers. Slavery depended on visible hierarchies. The presence of a submissive black man confirmed the legitimacy of the white male traveler. This inversion of Ellen and William's private relationship was emotionally costly yet strategically essential. Their escape demonstrated that slavery relied on ritualized performances of dominance and obedience as much as on legal definitions. The broader implications of Ellen's escape unsettled both supporters and critics of slavery. For abolitionists, her story was a powerful argument against racial determinism. If race could be convincingly performed, then the moral logic of slavery collapsed. For defenders of slavery, her escape was deeply threatening. It suggested that the system was vulnerable not only to rebellion but to intelligence and deception. This fear contributed to harsher laws and increased surveillance, particularly targeting free and enslaved black communities. Ellen's story also complicates modern understandings of resistance. Resistance is often imagined as open defiance or violent rebellion. Ellen's escape was neither. It was calculated, quiet, and dependent on deep knowledge of social norms. Her resistance lay in her ability to read the system accurately and exploit its blind spots. This form of resistance challenges simplistic narratives that equate power only with force. As historians later examined Ellen Craft's life, debates emerged about agency and constraint. Some emphasized her ingenuity and courage, highlighting her control over the escape. Others cautioned against romanticizing her actions, noting that her options were shaped by extreme coercion. Both perspectives reveal important truths. Ellen exercised remarkable agency, but that agency existed within a context of violence that limited her choices. Her escape was not freedom freely chosen, it was survival under duress. Ellen Craft's story also exposes the instability of racial categories. Slavery depended on the belief that race was fixed, visible, and meaningful. Ellen's successful passing demonstrated that these categories were socially constructed and enforced through habit rather than truth. This revelation remains relevant today, as societies continue to grapple with the legacy of racial classification and its consequences. By the late 19th century, as Ellen's story circulated through abolitionist literature and historical accounts, it became a touchstone for discussions about race, gender, and identity. Yet it was often simplified, stripped of its complexity, and framed as an exceptional tale rather than a critique of systemic power. This tendency reflects a broader pattern in historical memory, where individual success stories are used to obscure structural injustice. Ellen Craft's life resists such simplification. Her escape was extraordinary, but it did not dismantle slavery or prevent the rise of new forms of oppression. Instead, it revealed how fragile unjust systems can be when their assumptions are challenged. Ellen's legacy lies not in proving that anyone can escape oppression, but in demonstrating how oppression depends on rules that can be disrupted. Memory, erasure, and why her story disappeared. As the 19th century drew to a close, Ellen Craft's life stood as a quiet contradiction to the dominant historical narratives being constructed in the United States. The nation increasingly framed slavery as a regrettable but distant past, and Reconstruction as a failed experiment best forgotten. In this process, stories that challenged comforting myths were often minimized or erased. Ellen Craft's escape, which so clearly exposed the social mechanics of race and power, did not fit neatly into narratives that sought reconciliation without accountability. Historical memory is not neutral. It is shaped by those who control institutions, education, and publication. In the decades following Reconstruction, white supremacist interpretations of history gained dominance, particularly in the South. These interpretations reframed slavery as benign, minimized its violence, and portrayed formerly enslaved people as passive recipients of freedom rather than active agents of resistance. Within this framework, Ellen Craft's story posed a problem. It revealed intelligence, strategy, and self-determination in a woman the system had defined as property. As a result, Ellen's contributions were often overshadowed by male abolitionists or reduced to a single sensational anecdote. Her escape was sometimes retold as a clever trick rather than as a profound critique of social hierarchy. This reduction stripped her story of its political significance and transformed it into entertainment rather than analysis. The danger of such simplification is that it neutralizes the lessons her life offers about how oppression operates. Gender played a significant role in this erasure. Women's leadership within abolitionist and post-emancipation movements was frequently underdocumented and undervalued. Black women in particular were positioned at the margins of historical narratives. Their labor as organizers, educators, strategists, and symbols of resistance was essential, yet rarely centered. Ellen Craft's life exemplifies this pattern. Despite her central role in one of the most daring escapes in American history, she remained largely absent from mainstream historical accounts for generations. Race further compounded this marginalization. The post-Reconstruction period saw the entrenchment of Jim Crow laws and the institutionalization of racial segregation. In such a climate, acknowledging the intellectual and strategic brilliance of formerly enslaved black individuals threatened the ideological foundations of white supremacy. Forgetting Ellen Craft was not accidental. It was politically convenient. Even within abolitionist memory, Ellen's story was sometimes framed in ways that diminished her agency. Accounts often emphasized William Craft's role, or focused on the novelty of disguise rather than the planning, psychological discipline, and risk Ellen endured. This imbalance reflects broader tendencies to credit men with leadership while portraying women as supporting figures even when evidence suggests otherwise. Despite these forces of erasure, Ellen Craft's story did not disappear entirely. It survived in abolitionist writings, family histories, and later scholarly work. The publication of Running 1,000 Miles for Freedom preserved her voice and provided future generations with direct insight into her experiences. Yet access to such texts was limited, and their impact remained confined to specialized audiences for many years. The gradual recovery of Ellen Craft's legacy in the 20th and 21st centuries reflects broader shifts in historical scholarship. As historians began to prioritize social history, women's history, and black history, figures like Ellen Craft gained renewed attention. Scholars recognized that her escape was not an isolated anomaly, but part of a broader tradition of strategic resistance by enslaved people who understood and manipulated the systems that constrained them. This renewed interest also coincided with changing conversations about race and identity. Ellen Craft's successful passing challenged essentialist notions of race and highlighted its performative dimensions. In modern contexts, her story resonates with discussions about how identities are constructed, policed, and weaponized. Ellen did not merely pass as white. She revealed how whiteness itself functioned as a social passport. The rediscovery of Ellen Craft's life forces a reevaluation of how freedom is remembered. Traditional narratives often focus on legal milestones, the Emancipation Proclamation, constitutional amendments, court decisions. Ellen's story reminds us that freedom was also built through individual acts of courage and collective support networks. It was lived, negotiated, and defended long before it was codified in law. Ellen Craft's marginalization within historical memory thus mirrors the broader struggle over who gets to define the past. Remembering her fully requires confronting uncomfortable truths about how power operates not only in society but in storytelling itself. It requires acknowledging that history is shaped by exclusion as much as by inclusion. As Ellen's life re-enters public consciousness, it challenges modern audiences to reconsider assumptions about resistance. Her escape demonstrates that subversion can be quiet, calculated, and deeply intellectual. It also warns against celebrating individual triumphs without addressing the systems that made such heroism necessary in the first place.